Victoria Ray Moore is a creative entrepreneur, a PR professional, a mom, a wife, and a program facilitator for Connected2. Now she talks to me about social work here in the Low Country for this edition of Quintin's Close-Ups. And if you haven't already, subscribe to my YouTube channel and like Quintin's Close-Ups on Facebook. Victoria Ray Moore, welcome to Quintin's Close-Ups once again.
Thank you. It's good to see you. I miss you.
Oh, yes, ma'am. I'm right here, even if it's virtually. I know that you are a creative entrepreneur, a culture bearer, a culture worker, and a Connect2 program facilitator, and obviously the co-founder as well. Let me ask you, what is that culture that is connected to Connect2?
So Connected2 is a collective effort, and it represents a culture of the significance of what we're doing at the grassroots level. It represents the power in collaboration and the creativity that comes when artists and businesses and activists and young people and educators act in solidarity with one another and imagine a future together. That's Connected2. It's about the interracial, intergenerational efforts here in the Charleston area. And, you know, we live in a place that is so quickly right in front of our eyes. It's changing. It's being developed. And there are so many different vantage points on what a better future will look like. And Connected2, now Tiny is Powerful, really represents the people taking an active position and participating in shaping the future of this place together.
What are the vantage points here in Charleston that you all are actually focused on?
You know, it's really about the spirit of the arts and creativity and imagining a better future. So there are issues like displacement, I think would be the most policy forward conversation that we're part of is the fact that as these new things are developed, who's benefiting from them, who's participating in it, and at whose expense is the development. So I think that would be the most issue focused, and really the issue of racism and the impacts, where that comes from, the history of racism, how that's showing up in systemic and social structures today, and how we combat that through conversations and education, and again, through the spirit of the arts and the creativity.
What are those development benefits right now?
I think that's the question. You know, what's coming to my mind in this moment is right down the street from me in a little strip mall. There's the Destiny Community Cafe.
Right.
You know, and right now we know right now today that the developer of that strip mall has increased the rent for the sake of a profitable developmental vision, but then look at who's losing in that situation. The cafe can't afford to stay there anymore, and they were there in service of so many people and doing so much good and generating community just by their presence. And now they can't be there because the developer raises the rent and someone else is going to come there. And so that's the question: who benefits from that?
And when it comes to racism, as you just mentioned, how is that seeking into the social structure today?
I think that when we look at American history, we read a book. It's big. We read Stamped from the Beginning, which really outlines very well how the process of enslaving people and generating economy through that exploitation and the uses of other people, the mindset to even be able to do that, that is at the baseline of this place that we're all sharing together. So to say, how does racism seep through socially and systemically? That's a big question. That's a big question. One tangible example, though, and this ties back into development, is we looked at a book called The Color of Law. And there's a film that corresponds with that. It's a 15-minute film called Segregated by Design that I would recommend to anyone who has a few minutes and a curiosity. But it lays out residential redlining and the process of developing neighborhoods that were designed intentionally to keep races separate. We see that then in school systems. We see that in how communities relate with one another. So again, that's one example. The process of the legal segregation of neighborhoods is something that we're still dealing with the effects of today.
Where is the lighting that is in Charleston?
That would be a question probably more suited for someone who's been in real estate for a long time. At this point, I don't even know if it exists under the same name or under the same set of policies, but it just has to do with what are the rents, who's able to get the mortgages, who's owning the homes, who's controlling the land.
Speaking of which, as I was writing this down, what are those policies that you would like to see enacted in the next 5 years?
At this point, my focus is more on the grassroots community, and I hope that will inform policy over time. But I'm really more interested in generating conversations that make people at the grassroots level feel connected with one another. And then from that, we can imagine new policies together.
What is the conversation that's being had right now?
There are many conversations happening right now, and in the Charleston area especially. So, we just passed the annual, I hate to call it an anniversary, but just this past June was the anniversary of the massacre at the church. And that time of year every year stirs up a lot. And gosh, Quintin, it's so heavy. And I try to focus just on the conversations that I'm fortunate enough to be part of. Right now, there's a group of educators and also someone who works with Connected2 Tiny is Powerful, who are trying to figure out creative ways of shaping youth-led dialogue. So as adults and as civically engaged adults, sometimes I can speak for myself, I can get trapped in a cycle that I have to solve the problems and I have to know the answers and I have to do the work. But what happens if we create space where it's really the young people of today, younger than me, who are participating in the conversations, and what kind of ideas come when we really listen to them? So I'm grateful to be part of a collaboration among a group of educators who are being brave and who are being bold and who are trying to figure out creative ways of tapping into the fears and the dreams and the hopes and the lived experiences of the youth, so we can find out how are they being affected by the realities of today's landscape, and what ideas do they have for the future.
And as you know, you're on Twitter a lot, and they just created this whole thing called Spaces. But what spaces are you all creating for young adults here in Charleston?
So right before the pandemic on Reynolds Avenue, we had a storefront space that was partially given in kind to this group. We were able to install a body of work. It was sculptures, it was notes and documentation from the work that had been happening for years. And then it was just an open door. So while we were in that space, a group of young people who were actually a part of the youth entrepreneur program with Metanoia, who were our neighbors at that time, they came and they participated in a conversation, imagining a podcast, imagining a zine. So we talk about the social media, and the young people, of course, we know that is an undeniable part of culture. But then what ideas do they have within those spaces? So again, the idea of a podcast, the idea of a zine, and the community lab was an opportunity for those conversations to take place. We were in person. We were surrounded by materials and interactive pieces of art, and and again, the door was open. And so I really hope to be able to make more space like that as we get into I'm going to call it a post-COVID world, but a safe, still cautious, still mindful, but an opportunity to come together in an open space for conversations that aren't rooted in transactions. Because sometimes that's hard too. And I think that's one of the things about the kind of nonprofit space. And I'm getting to know it. It's a new terrain for me, but the idea that for a space to exist, it doesn't depend on the community, spending a bunch of money there. And obviously one hopes that community feels a sense of ownership and community wants to give to something that is serving community. That's the hope. But I liked that at the lab, the door was open. Anyone who wanted to do something could. If you wanted to show a film, you could. If we wanted to offer a workshop, we could. We could invite people in. People could just walk in and we could share a cup of coffee and really some really magical, I say magical, really powerful, really impactful conversations took place. And I hope that looking toward 2022, we're able to do something like that again.
How has nonprofit changed you?
It has been such a learning experience. So when I came into the Connected2 project, the collective was, what's the word I want to use? It was an informal collective. So it wasn't a nonprofit group. It was a group of individuals who had a shared set of values and who came together and an understanding of how to work together, and they received a grant. Well, once you start talking about grant, now you're in nonprofit language. Right. But there's a shift in my eyes in the world of nonprofits and philanthropy too, because like all other systems that we're working with at this time, there are undeniable problems and fractures. People are left out. It's not accessible to all. And oftentimes it's very top down and not all, honestly, the nonprofit organizations on the ground are doing some of the most important work in this town. And I'm speaking to Charleston, and I can speak to the country. Those are really the organizations that are meeting community needs in real time. And so when I talk about the learning curve, I've been in rooms that I didn't know existed with people who I didn't know before, talking about future plans and visions and trying to solve problems. But then again, you look around at the people in those rooms solving the problems and you have to ask, well, who's not in this room? And how do we mitigate that? And what are the barriers to entry and to tapping into these resources that are meant to serve community, that are meant to alleviate and combat the issues? How do the people on the ground tap into those resources? And so I see some positive changes. There's this new world to me of a giving circle, and that's, to me, seems like it might not be, but to me it seems like a frontier in the philanthropic world. Grants are very report driven, so you got to have hard numbers, hard budgets, clear outcomes, clear deliverables, clear needs. You have to be clear or it won't work. And in the giving circle model, at least in the one that I'm part of, there's a little bit more of an openness. The idea of a gift. For example, I'll say I'm part of a giving circle, and this circle of artists and cultural workers was brought together from around the country, from San Francisco to Texas to Georgia to South Carolina to Alaska. And we came together, and an arts institution, Yerba Buena Center for the Arts out of San Francisco, seeded this group of artists with a tiny deposit. And they said, look, we're going to give all of you at this circle this money. We're not giving it to any one of you. They could have given it to any one of us to fund our projects or our work. And they said, no, well, can we give it to all of you? And this collective of artists and cultural workers who never even knew each other had been getting to know each other for 6 weeks. And we were able to say, yeah, we see each other and we hear each other. And even if it takes a year or more to figure out how we're going to make this money have an impact in our groups, we're going to stick together and we're going to figure it out. So the first the first act of that giving circle was all of the, I don't like the word members, all of the participants in the circle, the cultural workers, the artists, the organizational leaders, received $5,000. We agreed amongst ourselves, hey, let's each give all of our projects $5,000 to serve whatever work you're doing on the ground in your community. And the only catch about that is that 1,000 of those dollars you have to give away. So just like we were given this, now let's put this into practice. Let's give $1,000 away. And the most challenging thing around that is resisting the impulse. So now I'm talking with the collective, and I'm talking with advisors, and I'm talking with mentors. I'm saying, hey, I have to give away $1,000. And not just me, the collective, the organization, formal or informal, we have $1,000 to give away. And how do we do that equitably? How do we let people know that this is available? How do we, do we break it into what is 1,000 divided by 5, right? Like, do we break it into $5 pieces and give out envelopes of $5? That could maybe be impactful, right? So again, it's the conversation around giving, among the criteria of defining need, around the criteria of measuring impact. And these are important conversations to have, but it's important to push those conversations further if we're really talking about accessibility and inclusivity and a long-term change. So I will share really quickly about that. We came to the decision to split it in half and to give $500 to an elder in the community and to give $500 to a youth in the community. So we came to that.
Who are the stakeholders that you want to bring into the room when it comes to this type of discussion?
I'm interested in talking with the artists, the activists, the educators, the young people. I'm interested in, and when we talk about all those groups, I want it to be as all-encompassing as possible. So when we talk about artists, not just talking about the traditionally understood artist, I think about artists and creatives and the businesses. The tiny businesses and honoring the tiny businesses who have existed forever and will live forever, like the barbershops, and also honoring this new wave of tiny businesses, which are the content creators and the social media consultants. So there's a spectrum. So when I talk about those groups, again, I want them to be big and wide and open to all.
As a matter of fact, you all said this on your website, quote, to support and promote tiny business as a vital part of commerce and neighborhood. What tiny businesses are you supporting and promoting in our commerce and neighborhoods today?
Yeah, so in the first couple of years of Connected2, we were able to connect with about 30 tiny businesses between the downtown, mostly downtown, a couple in North Charleston. And these were businesses, again, it's hard because I would like to name drop everybody who's on that list, because I believe that they all feel connected with this work and supported by it. And now COVID kind of put a stop. COVID made it hard to keep the relationships alive, and it made it hard to establish new ones. So we're in a period, and of those tiny businesses, if you go to that page of the website, the sad truth is that a number of them have now closed. And that's a reality for tiny businesses, whether it has to do with rent or displacement, or whether it has to do with kind of a change in generations, and maybe there's not someone to carry it on. So there are different challenges to owning a tiny business. I think the direct promotion of each of those individual businesses is a byproduct, and the focus is really on amplifying that the culture of tiny does exist, and that we are a network, and that we are able to exchange knowledge and skills and resources and connections, and that's what makes things possible on the ground level. So I would say if you go to tinyispowerful.org or .com and you visit the tiny business pages, you may be introduced to a number of businesses who you do or don't know. And we are actively now growing. And so that page will grow. Yeah. And again, if I'm not going to specifically name any of those 30, I also won't specifically name that there are at least 5 new connections, and not necessarily new businesses. These are generational businesses as well as young businesses. And hopefully there will be some frontward facing public art in addition to that page on the website that will amplify those voices.
What's different right now, the generational businesses or the younger businesses?
What's different? Let's talk about the hybrid of being physical in space and being virtual in space. And let's talk about the generational businesses that maybe, first of all, don't rely on the virtual world to reach their customers.
Right.
But we also have to ask, in order for them to get to the future, do they need to be in the virtual world in some capacity? So that's part of the learning and the knowledge exchange. But then from the young people who are more virtual, who are connecting in new ways, who are offering services, who are independent in a lot of ways, there's still so much that we can learn from our elders and from the kind of traditional ways of doing business and the traditional ways of relating with each other. So I don't know. I think the differences has to do with this whole digital frontier that recent generations were born into and that we navigate instantaneously with existing. I think that's a big difference.
How has the knowledge and obviously the resources changed over time with this new digital frontier?
Well, in an optimistic lens, we talk about how the internet makes everything possible. We have access to all the information. Any question you can ask the internet. We have to be careful with that. We have to be careful with that. But we do have access to connecting across regions now. So now tiny communities are on the ground, but there are tiny communities, like I said, like that giving circle that I'm part of. We are a tiny community of individuals, but we represent what's on the ground. So the frontier of the internet makes it possible that geography is not a limitation. And the frontier of the internet makes it possible that we have access to knowledge and platforms. We can reach, I'll call them customers, but we can reach our customers or our communities or our audiences in a way that is accessible if you have access to the hardware and to the internet, because we have to look at, there's a barrier there. Not everyone has access to the internet, especially if we look in rural communities. So as easily as we can talk about all the great things the internet can do, we also have to talk about the risk of the sharing of misinformation. We get into, and then we also have to talk about the accessibility even in that. We can't just assume that everyone can have a hardware and can understand the tutorials and do it. There's a book was given to me, and I'll give the full disclaimer, I haven't read it yet, but the synopsis is that there's, and it's a true book. There's a culture, an indigenous culture, where they migrate with the seasons. And so in the cold seasons, they move. And if the elders in that community, once they get to the age where they can't move themselves, the culture of this particular indigenous group is that they leave them, and they don't leave them to disregard them, but that's just part of how, that's the coming and going of life. Okay, you're 90 years old and you can't move yourself, and we have to get away from the winter, so we'll see you on the other side. And that's me paraphrasing. So with respect to the actual depth of that culture, but I use that as an example to say that we have to be mindful, and I want to be in a world where young people and our elders are caring for each other in our neighborhoods, and helping us all move toward the future. So for example, as we get in the virtual world, people say, well, let's have a virtual meeting. Let's have a Zoom meeting. Well, what if that's not accessible to me? Then my story doesn't get shared. If I can't get on the internet and post on my own social media, if I can't hop on a Zoom to be part of this meeting, does then my input matter less? So being conscious of those kinds of questions when we're having, again, community dialogues, and it's saying, and engaging with community, being aware of the different accessibility needs is important.
What are those tiny communities that are emerging here in Charleston?
Tiny emerging communities. I want to believe that I'm tiny emerging. I'm born and raised in Charleston. I'm from here. This is my home. So I feel that I'm a part of many communities. I'm part of the community in the neighborhood where I grew up. I'm part of the community of the city where I grew up. I'm part of the community of my church. I'm part of the community of my parents' friends, and who knows what communities they're part of. I'm part of the communities of the people I went to school with and their families. I'm part of a community. When I first moved back to Charleston in 2012, so much had happened. I was gone from 2007 to 2012. And that was when Charleston first started getting the accolades of a top tier city. So that's when the public eye was really coming in for the tourism dollars. And also during that time, there was so much creative energy happening. So when I came back in 2012, I found my way back into that pocket, to what I would call like the creative scene, and I'm curious when we talk about emerging communities. I'm curious about the next generation. Who younger than me? Where are the people younger than me? And I know some of them. And if they're watching this, I'm saying let's link up. But I do. I want to know who are the tiny emerging communities among younger people than me. And I don't want to age myself, but I'll just say it, full disclosure. I graduated high school here in 2007. So I'm not the oldest, but I'm not the youngest either. There are people younger than me, and I'm really curious, what they want to see, and what their reality is like. What are they doing amongst themselves that are generating hope and possibilities for the future? And how can my work support that? And yeah, so I'm curious about that too.
You talk about those tourism dollars. How can you all make certain that some of those tiny communities receive some of that?
Right. That's a big question. So when we talk about the tourism industry, that's kind of based on the marketing of the food and the food and art, and like, what do people travel for, right? And history, they come here because we have such a unique history. Right. So getting that to positively impact tiny, I think it's about expanding the landscape of what businesses are we celebrating, and what stories and what histories are we telling. And we also have to ask the question, it's about the tourism dollars in a way that's getting into a conversation I'm not yet part of, in terms of the taxes and the kind of hospitality. Like there are grants at a city level that are funded by the tax dollars. And so in that sense, maybe it's about generating a greater awareness of how to access those funds. And also it's about looking at who is eligible to receive those funds and in what ways. Those I'm posing those as questions to myself. I think that's part of the conversation, because it's not just about generating the foot traffic, though some businesses are positively impacted by increased foot traffic, but not all businesses are. And let's say they're not, like a barber, how does a barber benefit from the tourism industry? Or how does a, 40-plus-year-old flower shop benefit from the tourism industry? So I think that we can't just assume that tourism is the answer, the beginning and the end of the answer to economic empowerment. There's more there.
Yes, ma'am. What is the state of that economic empowerment?
In a COVID world and a post-COVID world, there were resources made available, need-based resources, which sometimes, again, when we get into conversations around need and how do we define need, that's a big conversation as well. Most recently, there was that grant. It came down, and it was like the oh gosh, and the name leaves me, but it came from the federal level to the state level to the city level.
Sure.
And then at the city level, there was an agenda of, okay, well, once we get access to these funds, where are we prioritizing it? And tourism was one area. And then community was actually a separate pillar of the priorities, which was interesting to me as an observation. I think my focus is on trying to be part of as many discussions as I can so that I can deepen what I understand. And then if I then can just become an agent for helping get information into communities in a way that is accessible and approachable and not so up here. Again, we talk about grants and language and funding, and sometimes it's like, oh, that seems so not in my realm. But if we can take that information and bring it down and really focus on talking directly to people talk, information goes out. We talk about the hierarchical structure. Who are the community leaders and who are the grass tops and who are the grassroots, right? And I don't know, shifting a little bit and focusing maybe on the grassroots level first in terms of impact. But again, there's a lot of responsibilities on our leaders to do that work. So that's again in the spirit of Connected2 and Tiny is Powerful. Artists, activists, educators, young people, tiny businesses. Hopefully, among us, we are connected also with our civic leaders and our representatives, and we can access information and share it with each other. And help each other tap into resources. I wish I knew more. A more direct way that I could say to you right now. But I would just say, email me. I would say tinyispowerful@gmail.com. Connect with me. And if I don't have the answers to questions, sometimes I know someone who might, or sometimes I know more than I think I know. So I'm better in that realm of like direct questions. Do I know of any funding opportunities right now in this exact moment? No, I don't. But again, it's not just about the money. It's also, again, about the resources and the community building and holding space for each other and conversations around money. They will come. They come. And conversations around economic empowerment. I mean, that's something we all want to see in community. Resources, safety, good schools, access to education, access to well-paying jobs, and also access to, an entrepreneurial future. People want the artists to starve. People think artists starve and tiny businesses will take care of themselves. And I don't mean to go off the cuff in that way, but I want to combat that stigma. I don't think artists have to starve. And I think that tiny businesses are essential, no matter how much big businesses exist. A neighborhood and a place, it's those tiny businesses and the people living in a place that really generate a spirit of place.
And how do you build that community 5 years from now with those artists and those tiny businesses?
The approach to building community is through collaborations. And when I say through collaborations, that's where everybody becomes involved and everybody has a sense of ownership and everyone has an opportunity to bring an idea. And that idea becomes a possibility instantaneously. So it's through collaborations. I hope that over the next 5 years, this community grows and I want to acknowledge that community already exists. It's not about creating community. Communities, this town is a town of communities intersecting with one another. And so hopefully Tiny is Powerful just becomes a platform that can amplify and celebrate and lift up and generate opportunities within those communities.
And what information is actually accessible right now for these communities?
I mean, if you go, so tinyispowerful.com right now kind of functions as an archive. So it has stories, it has tools, it has artworks. It also has what's called a community bulletin board. And what I would love to see, when I imagine and I say I imagined, when the community bulletin board was imagined, it was kind of like how when you go into a coffee shop and there's those cork boards and anyone can put a message on that board, an opportunity, a need, a service, a promotion, a question. And so I would love to see that community bulletin board utilized by more people. And again, the way you can go directly through the website, there's a tab that says something to share with a question mark. And so people can send information that way. They can also send information, like I said, via email, tinyispowerful@gmail.com. And in the short term, I'm working at my goal, my intention. I see things coming through. For example, I just saw the Donnelly Foundation shared in my emails. I received it. It was mass email. That they're looking for a visual artist right now. So that's an opportunity for a visual artist to create a piece of work. That could be a resume builder, portfolio builder. So an opportunity like that would be appropriate on the community bulletin board. I will put it there. But also anything else. I saw that the Fresh Future Farms, it came through my email, they are developing like farm kits. So that they're making the possibility of starting your own kind of home growing practice. They're working to build that infrastructure and make that accessible. So when I see things like that in my emails, my hope is that, and especially now that we're starting to get a little bit of footing post-COVID, I had a hard year, Quintin, and this is not me making excuses. I just am saying that to you. But hopefully the community bulletin board is a place where that information can be shared among these communities. You can email it to me directly, or you can submit it through the website. And hopefully that also becomes a resource where people start to know they can look there for those things.
Absolutely. And speaking of growing, I got to take it a little personal here for a second. How is Mariah doing, your daughter?
Mariah. Oh, thank you. And she's Mariah Ray Love Moore is the love of my life. And she is 2.5 years old. She is brilliant and she's kind. She's a little sassy, but she's great. She's great. I'm so grateful. I appreciate you for asking about her. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. And obviously earlier you talk about obviously a lot of people being creative artists here in Charleston. What do you want to create next as far as an art form?
Right now, I'm trying to understand developing a business and connecting with community. I'm trying to understand those as art forms. It's a little bit abstract. Simultaneously, in like a more traditional sense, I'm trying to lean into myself as a writer. I've been writing and journaling, and sometimes they're poems, sometimes they're not. I've been doing those things my whole life. Also, recently, as kind of a catharsis, I have a background as a dancer. And you always get wrapped up in saying, well, I used to be a dancer. No, I'm still a dancer. And recently I've started, if I have an opportunity outside, I'll put my headphones in and I just will dance full out, like you bop on the sidewalk, but no, I've been dancing, and in public spaces by myself. Oh. So exploring the art form of moving and connecting and writing, and then allowing all of that to also intersect with growing community somehow. I'm trying to figure that out.
And what would you write to the average person here in Charleston about Connect2?
So I would say to the average person, Connected2 was born out of a collective of individuals who have been doing social change work in Charleston for more than 30 years. And many of them are still involved and engaged in this work in one way or another. And this moment also represents a shift to bring in more of the next generation. So this work is not out of nowhere. There's a long legacy of grassroots efforts and collaborative efforts. And yeah, so I'm an average person. So to an average person like myself, I would say you understand it once you start to engage with the individuals and have conversations. So we have a circle of advisors. Those are volunteers who meet once a month. And those meetings are open. And so if someone wanted to come in that way as an entry point to starting to learn about what we're attempting to do together, I would say all are invited and are welcome. I would say that there's a zine being developed, and 2 editions have come out. And the hope is that people who contribute to the zine, again, that's a way to engage in the conversation. The young person who's leading the zine, Quintin, wanted me to extend an invitation to you that maybe you'll participate in an upcoming edition that's extending the series on this idea of what is generational wealth. And so that's continuing again into a series of conversations with community members here. And so I hope that that's something that you might be interested in talking about. So there are different points of access. There's a zine. I'm working to grow a podcast. So I'm following your lead, Quintin, in the commitment of what happens when people just talk and when it's shared publicly. So I'm hoping to grow a podcast as an entry point into coming into conversation, because it's all about collective effort and collaboration toward the future. That's what I would say.
What was your entry point into social work?
Probably my entry point. I want to acknowledge my parents. So my mom, she was is a real estate agent, but she was also always the president of the civic club in our neighborhood. So as 4 and 5-year-old, I was following my mom to these meetings, and I was acting as an assistant secretary, and I was taking notes. And then my dad, he served in law enforcement with the city of Charleston my whole life. And I remember going with him to his office sometimes. And, the dispatchers in the office, excuse me for getting a little emotional. I lost my dad this year. But yeah, I think my parents set a strong example of they both had tiny businesses. So my mom was in real estate and she led the civic club, and my dad was a police officer, but my mom also had Flowers by Beverly was her tiny business. And my dad had Boynton's Final Touch. That was his tiny business. And so I think the spirit of entrepreneurship, civic engagement, and service is something that I am grateful that was part of my nurturing and my upbringing. And then professionally, when I moved back to Charleston and I said that I wanted to go the independent route as a PR professional, as a communications professional, I was connecting then at the grassroots level with artists and creative people who were pursuing their dreams. And for me, community engagement, social engagement, that's a part of it too. Yes, it's about combating the issues, but it's also about nurturing the creativity of the possibilities. So professionally, that happened as soon as I came home. And then I think it's through working with Connected2 and this organization that I really leaned into the spirit of activism and the fearlessness that it takes to take a strong position and confront the issues. And so it's pretty much in me, and I'm continuing to grow in that world as well.
How do you confront that without having fear?
Without fear? How do you confront the issues without fear? Okay, sometimes there is fear. Sometimes there's fear and there's apprehension and there's nerves. So I think acknowledging that is part of it. And again, I think it's operating from a place of truth, having a strong sense of personal values and a confidence in personal values, having a willingness to listen when there are differences of opinions, and having the openness to understand that it's through our differences and through the conversations, even the polarizing, and especially the polarizing ones, where that's where the opportunities for growth exist. So when there's fear, to know that it's somewhere deep within that fear, actually, that where the greatest opportunities exist.
Victoria Ray Moore, thank you so much for your time. And again, welcome back to the award-winning Quintin's Close-Ups.
Thank you, Quintin.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.